Negotiating Soviet Nostalgia, Musical Memory and Format Adaptation, Russian Televised Singing Contest by New Millennium. Olga, you are welcome.
Thank you very much. Can you guys see my screen?
Yes, we do.
Excellent. All right, so you can see my PowerPoint. Great. Thank you very much for the presentation, and good morning from the Iowa time zone. And thank you for the organizers of the conference for bringing together this international group of speakers. It really is a pleasure to be here. So I will begin my paper with a short throwback to early December 2020, when viewers of the 9th season of the popular Russian television singing contest Golos, or The Voice, witnessed a heated exchange between two of the show's celebrity judges / mentors. Sergei Shnurov, better known as Shnur, the cynical, foul-mouthed provocateur and frontman of the band Leningrad, accosted Valery Syutkin, the ever impeccably dressed former vocalist of the legendary group Bravo. And I quote, "This repertoire reminds me of the Soviet song of the year 1982. It's the year 2020 out there. Maybe you should listen to the radio every once in a while. Songs are different today," grimly announced Stur, alluding to the retro style of the songs that were just performed by the contestants coached by Syutkin. That included, among other compositions, Alla Pugacheva 1976 hit «Не отрекаются любя». Syutkin retorted that Shnur's repertoire was just as, quote, old, and in fact, quote, was born the same year he, Shnur, was born, pointing to the latter's team presentation of the song «Помоги мне» from the 1968 Leonid Gaidai's comedy Diamond Arm. While the banter between the two judges added comedic relief to the show, and might have even been orchestrated by the show's producers for the sake of TV ratings in the first place, the ample use of covers of Soviet songs, ranging from Second World War compositions to songs from Soviet cinema and Soviet estrada tunes, has indeed become a trademark of this Russian singing contest. Golos, the Russian adaptation of the television format The Voice, that was originally created by Dutch media tycoon John de Mol in the Netherlands in 2010, has aired annually on Russia's state-supported TV Channel 1 since October 2012, and has now enjoyed 9 chart-topping and award-winning seasons. As an extension of the original concept, Channel 1 has also produced 7 seasons of a spin-off for the younger generation, entitled Golos Дети, or The Voice the Kids, and as well as 3 seasons of The Voice Senior for contestants 60-plus age category, all 3 of them following Dutch original concepts. It is also worth mentioning that Russia was the first country in the world to import the Dutch Voice 60-plus format. With some structural and organizational variations, all 3 versions, oops, let me see, there, I'll go back a second, there. All 3 versions of Golos begin with the trademark round of blind auditions in which 3 or 4 nationally known celebrity expert mentors, who also serve as the show's judging panel, select members for their respective teams without seeing the auditioning contestants and relying exclusively on the contestants' vocals. Beyond the blind auditions round, in which contestants select their own songs, often from a list of compositions recommended by the show's organizers, the repertoire selection is largely in the hands of the judges and the show's producers. During the blind auditions and the early rounds of the show, the coaches decide which contestant progresses to the next round. Now, the live, usually semifinal and final rounds, the television audience votes to select the top 4 finalists, as well as the show's winner, crowned as the best voice of the country. Foregrounding a sense of transgenerational cultural continuity, the judges on the show usually represent a wide range of historical eras and musical genres. For example, the first 3 seasons of Golos featured a veteran of the Moscow rock scene, Alexander Gradsky, the folk flamenco singer and songwriter from the 1990s, Leonid Agutin, as well as representatives from a younger generation of pop stars, the high-profile Eurovision participant Dima Bilan and folk singer Pelageya. In a similar vein, in addition to the aforementioned seasoned performers Shnur and Syutkin, the mentors of the most recent installment of Golos also included more contemporary faces of Russia's music scene, such as one of Russia's leading rappers, Basta, and another recent Eurovision participant, the pop star Polina Gagarina. Whether or not the show's song selection reflects the mentor's level of cultural sophistication and taste, or the well-roundedness and solid musical education of the Golos contestants, the use of a nation's musical heritage without the voice format is certainly not strictly a Russian phenomenon. By way of example, the most recent 20th season of American Voice featured 146 songs total in various competition rounds. Of this musical selection, roughly 40% hailed from the 20th century, with songs dating back to the 1940s through the 1990s. Similarly, and I'm jumping to a completely different country, roughly 44% of the repertoire of the most recent 9th season of The Voice Brazil consisted of covers of songs from the 20th century as well, while another 40% was comprised of songs from the teens of this century. Now, Russia's example, and here I'm using the data from the 9th season of Golos, is much heavier on the 20th century material. In 2020, the competition rounds of the show featured a total of 144 songs, of which roughly 62% came from the 20th century repertoire, and approximately 42% total redeployed pop cultural capital of the pre-1991 Soviet era. It is also worth noting that, unlike many other national versions of The Voice, Russia's Golos is a fairly multilingual project. For example, during the 9th season of Golos, 65 songs, or 45%, were performed in Russian, and 64 songs, or 44%, in English. The remaining compositions were sung in a variety of languages: French, Italian, Arabic, Spanish, Belarusian, etc. From a linguistic perspective, of this 42% of pre-1991 material, only 16%, 23 songs total, came from the Soviet repertoire performed in the Russian or Belarusian languages. The earliest Soviet-era song, as you can see, of the season was Eduard Hill's 1968 «Ходит песенка по кругу», and the latest 1989 «Белые розы» by the infamous Russia's first boy band «Ласковый май». Additionally, even though 29 of the 20th century songs came from the English language musical heritage, some of them were in reality well known and even popular in the Soviet Union. So perhaps they could be counted as Soviet repertoire to some degree, such as hits by a Greek singer from the 1970s, Demis Roussos, or even the Beatles. With only about 20-some of the 144 songs truly belonging to the Soviet era, notwithstanding Schnur's and Sutkin banter I described earlier, the overall repertoire of Golos can hardly be labeled as uniformly vintage. In fact, one could argue that by presenting the Soviet musical heritage alongside Russian songs of the new millennium, folk songs from various ethnic backgrounds, world opera, as well as Western rock and pop, Golos creates a unique meta-narrative of the Soviet and post-Soviet, as well as Russian and international popular music scenes. While for some viewers, irony or nostalgia might dominate their individual perception of the show, or at least its Soviet music-inspired component, Golos is perhaps a better illustration of what Kevin Platt described in his recent analysis of the Latvian New Wave singing competition as Soviet retro, as opposed to post-socialist nostalgia. Platt argues that, and I quote, retro, in distinction from nostalgia, describes revivals of past cultural goods with few of the implications of existential crisis or incurable homesickness associated with nostalgia. Retro makes past history close to us rather than apprehending and struggling against historical distance. So with retro referring, quote, to the revival or continuation of traditions, a contestant's performance of a song from the Soviet era during a 21st century singing competition appears to, quote, reclaim and redeploy the mass and popular cultural capital of the Soviet era for those who remember, and renovated for listeners of the new generation. Just like the Latvian New Wave competition, while repurposing Russia's Soviet heritage, all three iterations of Golos appeared to make a candid attempt to reconnect with the Soviet musical scene, or what Platt describes as a stance of earnest piety, without any signs of irony, parody, or mockery. One example of such earnest reappropriation of Soviet cultural capital noted by Platt is Golos's occasional pairing of foreign performers with Soviet-era repertoire, perhaps as an effective strategy to sway the audience's votes through the use of familiar golden oldies. As a side note, I should point out that even though the official rules of the show state that participation in Golos is open to Russian citizens ages 17 and older, the show's contestants are recruited not only from Russia proper, but also from many former Soviet republics, countries of the erstwhile Eastern Bloc, and such far-flung foreign lands as the USA, the UK, Cameroon, Uruguay, Brazil, Cuba, France, China, Ecuador, etc., you name it, even though most of these countries have their own versions of The Voice. An example of this ostensible spirit of harmonious global and cross-generational musical unity was the darling of Golos season 6, the Beijing-born eccentric young vocalist and actress Yang Ge. While Yang Ge auditioned on the show with the cover of the Beatles' English-language song Come Together and later performed Nirvana's Smells Like Teen Spirit during one of the competition rounds, her eclectic musical portfolio on Golos also featured such Russian-language Soviet cinematic musical hits as «Мне нравится» romance from the 1975 film «Ирония судьбы» или «С легким паром», «Моей душе покоя нет» from the 1977 film «Служебный роман» and «Где же ты мечта» from the 1975 film «Раба любви». While for some viewers, nostalgia may be at play in the reception of these familiar Soviet classics, for the performer, these songs were perhaps merely ready-to-use musical frameworks that conveniently highlighted her unique vocal abilities. One can only speculate whether the choice of songs that had the potential to serve as mnemonic bridges to the Soviet past for some of her viewers was a calculated strategic move by the singer and her mentor, Dima Bilan, employed to ingratiate the contestants with her voting audience. But in any case, Yang Ge was one of the rare instances where an international competitor advanced into the Golos's top 4 finalists. In sharp distinction from Yang Ge and most, I would say, other younger contestants on Golos, who usually do not have an immediate emotional attachment to the Soviet musical material they perform, Golos 60 Plus is a show that foregrounds a much more personalized connection between the performers and their repertoire. Unlike any other iteration of the Golos format, Golos 60 has traditionally featured a notable selection of songs from the Soviet era. For example, the most recent 3rd season of Golos 60 included a total of 60 competition numbers. 78% of these compositions, came from the 20th century, and another almost 17% from the pre-revolutionary era. One of the earliest Soviet songs during season 3 of Russia's Voice Senior was Исаак Дунаевский «Песенка Анюты» from Grigory Alexandrov's 1934 film «Веселые ребята». The latest Soviet-era composition is Valery Leontiev's 1983 hit «Полет на дельтаплане». The song selection also included works from the oeuvre of Anna German, Muslim Magamayev, Iosif Kobzon, Lyudmila Zykina, Sofia Rotaru, Maya Krystalinskaya, and other Soviet estrada classics, as well as musical compositions from such Soviet films as «Тени исчезают в полдень», «17 мгновений весны», «Русское поле», «Моя улица», and others. Overall, because the majority of songs on Golos 60 Plus are performed in Russian, almost 75% of this show's repertoire represented borrowings from the Soviet musical archive. An important element of the structure and poetics of Russia's version of Golos Senior is the show's reliance on the performers themselves as historical props, live links to the historical era that offers a sense of authentic connection with the material they're performing. An example of a performer as an embodiment of the living past in post-Soviet Russia, or to borrow Natalia Ivanova's apt term back from 1997, the nostalgia or nostalgia, is the winner of most recent 3rd season of Golos 60 Plus, 91-year-old Dina Yudina, who happens to be a survivor of the Nazi blockade of Leningrad. In the show's finale, the contestant performed an emotional rendition of the song «Мой милый, если б не было войны», popularized during Soviet times by Valentina Толкунова in a 1981 Soviet war film «Приказ огонь не открывать». emphasizing the effective, albeit somewhat hackneyed message of the song, reframing its content as her own personal experience and creating a tangible link to the Second World War through her own memories, Yudina wrapped up her performance with a brief testimony. The performer shared that her father had never made it to her own current age of 91, having died in 1945 in Hungary at the age of 40. Yudina then read a poem that she had written herself, dedicating it to the memory of her father and all those who did not return from the war. Just as with Dina Yudina, Gola 60 Plus features many other living vessels of the collective memory of the Soviet era, whose performances and personal stories contribute to what Sergei Ushakin describes as forms of public remembrance and envisioning history as assemblage of emotionally charged objects, a not really uncommon phenomenon in 21st century Russia. On the other hand, a much younger crop of performers, aged 6 to 14, is embraced by the show Golas Дети, whose general aesthetics is not explicitly shaped by the ethos of remembering the past. Indeed, looking at the most recent 8th season of the show, almost 40% of the repertoire comes from the 21st century and includes covers of ultra-contemporary compositions by today's pop and TikTok stars, both Russian and foreign, Artik and Asti, Zivert, Billie Eilish, etc. It is perhaps somewhat surprising that approximately 58% of the show's covers still reference songs from the 20th century in Russian and other world languages, and roughly 17% of the material is borrowed from the Soviet musical heritage and includes songs by Alla Pugacheva, Mikhail Boyarsky, Alexander Rosenbaum, and Viktor Tsoi. While updating Soviet originals for today's young performers, many mentors choose to incorporate contemporary elements into Soviet classics, repurposing the Soviet songbook to make it more accessible and relevant to post-millennial performers and television viewers, while also possibly evoking a sense of nostalgia in others. As is the case, for example, with rapper and Golas Дети Season 8 mentor Yegor Krit, whose recent rendition of the 1964 song Spят усталые игрушки intertwined Soviet lyrics with his own original text and musical score. I will conclude by saying that Golas is not an entirely novel format for Russian television. In fact, there were similar TV singing contests in the Soviet Union, most notably Allo, мы ищем таланты, Hello, we're looking for talent, that was launched in 1965 as a contest for amateur performers who competed for a recording contract with the Soviet record label Melodia. Incidentally, the Soviet show was canceled in 1972 after its production team was caught taking bribes. While initially Golas has been praised by viewers and critics as an honest and above-board affair, in recent years, the contest has been plagued by its own share of scandals and tensions, especially concerning the fairness of judging, nepotism, and rigging of outcomes. As they say on TV, stay tuned to see if Golas will manage to avoid the deleterious legacy of its Soviet predecessor. In the meantime, the program continues to go about the business of rewriting the Soviet, post-Soviet, and world music scenes into an idealized, harmonious, well-marketed musical assortment, and above all, a profitable TV reality show. I will stop right here, and I will be happy to answer any questions.
Thank you very much for your presentation. We will take questions at the end of the session. First, we will listen to all the papers as at the previous panels. So thank you once again. And for those who want to ask questions to Olga, and in case you're afraid that you will forget, you can start writing them in our chat room. And it's better if you address it to everyone. And so far, I'm happy to introduce our next speaker, Mark Lipovetsky from Columbia University, Dressing the Soviet in Drag, Vlad Mamushev's Monroe's Soviet series. Mark, you're welcome.
Thank you, Luba. Thank you so much. And thank you to organizers and first of all to Valery for having me. And I'm sorry that I couldn't join earlier. It was way too early where I am now. So I'm in the beginning of my day today. All right. So as Olga, I will open my PowerPoint and hope that it will not fail me as it happens sometimes. So,
So, Mark, we can hear
yes.
you.
Yeah, I understand, but I'm trying to open the PowerPoint, but you cannot hear me.
We can. It's okay.
Okay, all right. Okay, sorry. Let me open the PowerPoint. I hope you can see it, right?
Yes, we can.
Sure. All right. My paper will discuss recycling of themes and images from official Soviet art and visual propaganda in the works by the performance artist Vladislav Mamyshev-Monro. Екатерина Андреева has recently published an article on the same subject. Советское произведение Владислава Мамышева-Монро, Вестник Санкт-Петербургского университета, Искусствоведение, volume 11, number 1, 2021. However, our approaches are quite different. She explores his entire oeuvre and all his uses of Soviet motifs through the prism of Mamyshev's own quasi-mythological self-commentaries. I am analyzing some of his Soviet projects through the prism of the mythology of the trickster that, as I argue, Mamyshev-Monro productively, if involuntarily, conflated with the queer and camp sensibility, as discussed by Susan Sontag in her famous notes on camp. The word trickster frequently pops up in critical or memoirist writings about Mamyshev-Monro. Both his cross-gender performances and performative practices in his everyday life triggers such an association. Thus, Andrei Khlobystin speaks about the connection of transvestism in general and Mamyshev-Monro's art in particular with the jester and carnival traditions. Olesya Turkina and Viktor Mazin argue that Mamyshev-Monro's anarchic freedom, quote, leads not to the schizophrenic doubling of the world, but to the role of a quasi-trickster, the one who dons and tears off masks and speaks the truth, in quotation marks, about oneself and others. I only don't understand the meaning of the prefix quasi before the trickster in this quote. Maria Kravtsova compares Mamyshev-Monro with 18th century adventure seekers who combined roguery with a playful messianism. Both Khlobystin and Ekaterina Andreeva interpret Mamyshev as the successor, albeit inconsistent, to the tradition of ancient cynicism as described by Sloterdijk, cynicism, and Foucault, paresia. A journalist and restaurant owner, Katya Bakuchava, compares Monro with a little devil with an angelic face, whom, quote, you would pamper as a little child until he, for example, burns your apartment. But even after this, you won't get rid of him, quote, end quote. One may easily detect the constants of the trickster trope in Mamyshev-Monro's oeuvre and artistic image. Sorry, here some other examples of his. Here I'm referring to my own model of the tricks, what I call trickster trope, as the sort of the concentration of the trickster myth that is being passed through centuries and helps to recognize the trickster when we see it. So in my model, there are constants and there are optional features. I'm not talking about optional features just now. The most important constants are ambivalence, transgressivity, which is always connected with the sacred, laughter, and metaposition. And metaposition can be expressed through different means. And so here in this unpleasant pink, you can see some methods to express metaposition, and there can be more than one effectively used. If we are trying to apply this model to Mamyshev-Monro, we can see a lot of parallelisms. right? His art is indeed transgressive, but not only because of his open queerness that inevitably confronts the homophobic mainstream, but also due to his constant assassinations of something sacred. He impersonates Hitler and bin Laden and makes fun of the national favorites from Lyubov Orlova to Stirlitz. Mamышев Monroe doesn't spare any other norms as well, moral, social, or cultural. Ekaterina Andreeva includes into one of her articles about Mamышев Monroe an impressive list of his not always so innocent transgressions, among which most famous is his burning of the apartment belonging to Boris Berezovsky's daughter. Laughter here, right, is definitely characteristic of Monroe's art that is organically connected with different forms of carnivalistic inversions, mesalliances, and metamorphoses. However, Mamышев Monroe's laughter is highly original in Russian context, since he appears to be a pioneer of camp as the queer sensibility in art, including a special sense of comedy. According to Susan Sontag, the whole point of camp is to dethrone the serious. Camp is playful, anti-serious. One can be serious about the frivolous, frivolous about the serious. Among defining features of camp, Sontag lists such contradictory ones as extravagance and exaggeration, total asceticism and theatricality, the indistinction between the good and bad taste, dandyism, and strong ties with the homosexual culture. While it's not true that camp taste is homosexual taste, there is no doubt a peculiar affinity on overlap, right, she writes. Camp is ambivalent by definition, by default, but not satisfied with it, Mamышев Monroe deliberately increases the sense of the ambivalent as his leading artistical principle. His art is ambivalent because, according to his own self-descriptions, he always enjoys the moment of a metamorphosis into the object of his impersonation. In his projects, the distinction between parody and admiring imitation is frequently elusive. Mamышев Monroe semi-jokingly denoted his artistic method as, it's hard to pronounce, as insinuationism, that includes both live creation and simulations of the creative work that are so elaborate that replace art itself. Mamышев names Timur Novikov as the author of this method, but also lists Hitler and Stalin among its forefathers, since they also succeeded in creating large-scale falsifications that effectively replace reality. This is certainly the trickster's method of deception, which absorbs both post-Soviet cynicism and postmodernist hyperreality of simulacra. Finally, every trickster, and let me get back to this again, seeks a metaposition that would secure his or her freedom to judge, perform, and mock within any given cultural milieu. As Bakhtin wrote about the tricksters, their life maskers, лицедеи жизни, their being coincides with their role, and outside this role, they simply do not exist. They have the right not to understand, the right to confuse, to tease, to hyperbolize life, the right to parody others while talking, the right to not be taken literally, not to be oneself, the right to live a life in the chronotope of an entr'acte, the chronotope of theatrical space, the right to act as a comedy and to treat others as actors, the right to rip off the masks, the right to betray to the public a personal life down to its most private and prudent little secrets, end quote. These characteristics fully match not only Mamышev's autumn mythology, but also his consistent hyper-performatism. Again, hyper-performatism. Mamышев himself called this feature of his talent всевмещаемость, which I may translate into English as all-inclusivity, as in his text, where are my things? Ekaterina Andreeva characterizes it as an echo of Dostoevsky's universal responsiveness of the Russian soul, всемирная отзывчивость. I see here another manifestation of camp. Hyperperformativity combines camp's knack for the universal and exaggerated theatrification with a persistent sense of distance and detachment, as Zonta writes, Kemp proposes a comic vision of the world. If tragedy is an experience of hyper-involvement, comedy is an experience of under-involvement, of detachment, end quote. Kemp motivates the detachment by purely aesthetic interest to the subject, but it also releases the performer from any kind of moral responsibility, which corresponds to the trickster's ability to be, quote, amoral rather than immoral, as one of the scholars of tricksters, Lewis Hyde, wrote. See also a remark of the photographer Valery Katsuba about Mamушев Monroe. Vladislav is doomed to be forgiven. He is constantly balancing between being loved and being hated by everyone. Владислав все прощаем, он постоянно балансирует на грани всеобщего любимца и всеобщего нелюбимца. Symptomatically, Mamушев Monroe impersonations of different historic characters have an openly postmodernist effect of the perpetual present, according to Frederick Jameson, that suggests a virtual elimination of history and historical perspective. History appears only as a costume, and not even a historical one, but the one which a contemporary audience would recognize as historical. In other words, such a morphing reproduces a kitschy image of the historical accuracy, in quotation marks, creating a simulacrum in the chain of simulacra. However, what distinguishes Mamушев Monroe, say, from Екатерина Рождественская, and let me show you what I have in mind, yes, Екатерина Рождественская's historical portraits of pop celebrities, is the detectable sense of irony. Compare these products with, for example, these portraits of Ivan the Terrible and Dostoevsky, performed by Mamушев, of course. In Mamushev's works, we certainly can detect a sense of irony towards his impersonations and towards his characters, a shimmering distance from the created image that is being seen in his mythological and historical series alike. However, with the greatest clarity, Mamушев Monroe's metaposition manifests itself in his non-binary representation of the male-female dichotomy. The tradition of Soviet travesty, such as Baba Yaga, routinely performed in Soviet fairy tales, movies by Georgy Miller, Alexander Kalyagin as the Charlie's aunt, Vadim Tankov and Boris Vladimirev as Veronika Mavrikyevna and Evdotia Nikitishna. So these are sort of the examples of Soviet drag queens, and in all these examples, women's features were used almost exclusively as comical and low in comparison to the normative man's characteristics. Post-Soviet drag queens, such as, for example, Verka Serdyuchka, or aggressively misogynistic performance in Roman Viktuk's theater, not only preserve but aggravate this approach, which in new context also paradoxically acquires homophobic overtones. Although Mamушев Monroe hardly knew any other tradition of drag queen performances, probably it was his trickster's ways that allowed him to minimize homophobia and misogyny embedded in the Soviet drag, while emphasizing the queer and camp as a liminal zone between genders. The emphasis on the queer as the liminal zone of freedom from gender stereotypes can be best illustrated by the work that brought Mamушев international fame, his portrait of Gorbachev as an Indian woman, 1989. By transforming an official photo of the General Secretary into a kitschy portrait with rosy cheeks, colored lips, heavy makeup on eyes and eyebrows, wearing an earring and necklace, and most importantly with a red dot on the bald forehead, surprisingly did not denigrate Gorbachev as one would expect. Rather, this representation transforms him into an androgynous divinity, a naive image of the angel of peace rather than a new ruler of the Soviet Empire. At the same time, there is an obvious irony in the ease with which a black and white official portrait can be transformed into an androgynous icon of the kitschy Oriental beauty. The positive message of this morphing was obvious and liberating for anyone, which explains why this image appeared on the covers of so many Western magazines in the early 90s. The Gorbachev portrait is followed by Monroe's long-going series, The Politburo, which he was developing and adding in 1990, 1995, 2002, and 2011, in which grotesquely exaggerated, almost clownish makeup turns Politburo members into funny and non-appealing, unlike Gorbachev, drag queens. Monroe is not employing homophobic tropes as a satirical device here. By dressing Soviet functionaries in drag, he performs the transfiguration of scary death masks, which are their faces indeed, into carnivalesque figures. Mamashев is, in one of interviews, recalled that his mother, the party apparatchik, when he was a child, taught him to recognize all the Politburo members by names by playing with him a lotto-like game with their little portraits cut off from a newspaper. The morphing of these deflated icons of power, thus for Monroe, defamiliarizes the familiar, makes it strange as Pershklovsky, and hence valuable again, but this time aesthetically rather than politically. After Mamashев Monroe's editing, the new versions of the Politburo official portraits appear to be filled with life and color, although the grotesque tension between their former death-like and present carnivalesque representations remains tangible. Mamashев Monroe's attitude to the socialist realist classics, exemplified by Lyubov Orlova, the protagonist of his several projects, is more complex. On the one hand, he writes an article, «Впечатляющее величие советской эстетики и тоталитаризма, an impressive greatness of Soviet totalitarian aesthetics, 1993, in which he praises Soviet heroic mythology and as not only comparable with ancient Greek myths, but also, like them, serving as a source of aesthetically perfect works, not named, of course. On the other hand, he imagines Lyubov Orlova as the antipode of his alter ego, Marilyn Monroe. If Marilyn, when performed by Mamashев, personalizes sentimentality and sensuality, Lyubov Orlova, on the contrary, embodies a death-like mask of happiness. And the aggressive willpower, the mask of happiness, ground the hierarchy of the non-existing fairy tale-like paradise depicted in all her films. Orlova herself would better match an non-existing first name Will, Volia, with the last name Still, Stalnaya, that reflects her professional and personal qualities more faithfully, end quote. In the later interview, he adds even angrier definitions of Orlova while comparing her with the Snow Queen that radiates icy cold and absolutely asexual power, and thus enhances the regime's cynical dominance. Orlova appears in two of Mamashev's projects. In the series of photographs Happy Love, Счастливая Любовь, of course, here is also a pun on his name, 2000, and in Pavel Labazov and Andrei Silvestrov's remake of Grigory Alexandrov's classical comedy, Volga Volga, with Mamashев playing Orlova Strelka, and this project won the Kandinsky Prize. The first series strikes by Orlova's choreographed poses, sophisticated costumes, and interiors oversaturated with symbols of wealth and abundance. Old paintings, porcelain, crystal glasses, and carafes. Most likely, Mamashев Monroe wanted to emphasize the hypocrisy of Soviet culture that propagated the revolution and egalitarianism, while rewarding most active promoters of these values with the bourgeois lifestyle and comfort. However, the results appear to be more ambivalent. Twice Mamyshev Orlova depicts Orlova against the background of ships, a revolutionary cruiser Aurora and the legendary icebreaker Krasin, which for more than a year had been stuck in the polar ice. In both photos, Orlova's appearance contrasts these symbols of the epoch. Her outfit with white socks and furs has nothing to do with the revolution and the heroic hardships. She appears as a timeless figure, free from the Soviet world and using it only as a flashy background for her timeless beauty. In other words, Orlova also manifests a fairy tale-like freedom, choreographed, manufactured, paid by lies and betrayal, but nevertheless impressive and luring. Much less attractive Orlova appears in the remake of Volga Volga. Mamyshev Monroe's face with a heavy makeup is pasted over real Orlova in the scenes from Alexandrov's film. Nothing is changing dialogues, but it is Mamyshev Monroe who says Strelka's text with the tone of his voice rapidly jumping from the artificially girlish to masculine. All songs are also performed by Mamyshev Monroe, who intentionally terribly distorts the music. In Volga Volga, the real Orlova played one of a few female tricksters in Soviet culture who, by her own hyper-performativity, confronts rigid bureaucratic power of Byvalov. Mamyshev Monroe's performance transforms Strelka into an alien-like monster with a motionless face and frozen smile. Much like a fictitious Dunya, this monster substitutes for real Strelka, while anybody watching the film understands who is who. The meaning of this substitution becomes clear only in relation with photographs from the series Happy Love. The monster from Volga Volga secures the comfort of the elegant lady from the photo series. Furthermore, being this monster is the price for Orlova's freedom and beauty, or its ugly hide-like shadow. This is the trickery that Mamyshev Monroe apparently rejects. His idea of hyper-performativity suggests that each of his fictional persona manifests freedom, and each of them is therefore beautiful in its own way. Mamyshev Monroe's remake of the famous scene from 17 мгновений весны, the 17 moments of spring, director Tatiana Leoznova, 1973, is focused on Stiritz's, the protagonist's, silent and contactless date with his wife. So according to the original plot, so Stiglitz is on a mission abroad, and so sometime before the World War II breaks, his bosses arrange the visit of his wife, who can see him from a distance, and this sort of exchange of sights constitutes 4 minutes of silent and highly sentimental.
Mark, do you realize that you are eating into the time for your questions? I was sending you, yes, I was sending you messages like 5 minutes left, 2 minutes left.
I'm sorry, I didn't didn't see them because I have the full screen. So according to okay, so I will finish it up. Okay.
Just 2 minutes to wrap it up.
2 minutes to wrap it up, all right. So I won't be showing it as I planned to, but believe me, it's very funny and it's easy to find it. And while recreating this iconic scene, Mamyshev Monroe in this performance, on the one hand, reveals repressed sexuality of the original, and on the other, emphasizes the striking contrast between Stiglitz and his wife. Mamyshev, who plays both, of course, depicts Stiglitz as a decadent dandy, probably gay and definitely queer, with grotesque features and facial gestures. She, on the contrary, appears either as an ordinary mundane lady with no distinctive features except for an awful hairdo and some kasholka in her hands, or a drag queen in the Soviet clothes. Thus, the video produces two opposite interpretations simultaneously. One is about a hidden passion of two gay men separated by duty and secrecy. Another offers an alternative reading for the entire cult TV series, turning a spy thriller into a story of a gay man who can be himself only when he is away from his stern motherland. In this interpretation, Shirley's wife appears as the personification of this very motherland, Жена моя до боли, who patiently waits for him to return and whom he would rather avoid as long as possible. In both readings, however, Marsha Monroe performance critiques the heteronormative optics that fails to notice painfully obvious queer overtones of this scene and the entire figure of Shirley. The coexistence of several parallel interpretations, especially with sexual and queer overtones, is the epitome of camp. According to Sontag, the camp sensibility is one that is alive to a double sense in which some things can be taken. When a person or a thing is a camp, a duplicity is involved. I believe that's the main meaning of Mamashev's work with Soviet imagery and with any authoritative imagery for that matter. His laughter, his campy laughter, signifies the liberation from the delimiting gender norms and restraints through an outburst of queer freedom. Essentially, all Mamashev's performances of the Soviet display an inseparable fusion of camp, the queer, and freedom. And this is also a formula of his trickery, which explains, by the way, why he refused to lend his art to the aggressive state propaganda. This decision would be incompatible with all major components of his art and live performance. Thank you so much, and sorry for taking more time than it was supposed.
Mark, thank you very much for your great talk. Everyone can reserve questions for Mark till we finish listening to the other papers. So thanks again. And our next speaker, I'm happy to introduce Rindesbacher Hans from Pomona College in Clermont. And the topic is Beyond Regime Change, the persistence of fragrance, Krasnaya Moskva. And Krasnaya Moskva was written in Russian. So Hans, you're welcome.
Good afternoon, everybody. I have started the screen share. Can you see it?
Yes, we can.
Yes, okay. Good afternoon. For you, I know it's the last panel. For me, the day is only just beginning in California. I want to thank the organizers, Valery, Yulia, and I'm sure others who made this event possible. It's my pleasure to be here. The PowerPoint is really more illustrative than it is absolutely necessary. I'm talking about Krasnaya Moskva, the scent emblematic of the Soviet high life world. The question I want to address is simple, but as you will see, it has many answers. How has this emblem of Stalinist consumer culture with pre-revolutionary roots survived into our own time? How did a perfume, an evaporative chemical substance, non-essential for survival, in its creation linked to the nobility in Tsarist times, and therefore ideologically misaligned in early Bolshevism? It was bourgeois after all, it was individualistic, it was decadent, then become appropriated under socialism for a culturally and economically rising proletariat, supporting the very embourgeoisement of that proletariat in Stalin's 1930s. How did it rise to the pinnacle of female elegance in Soviet society, then manage to survive the economic collapse and restructuring of the socialist system in the 1990s, become democratized and re-emerged into the middle class of our own present times of global capitalist realism, as I want to call it? My paper suggests some answers. Why a perfume, a near immaterial luxury product that disappears in its own usage, has outlasted artwork, architecture, and monuments made of bronze or marble or concrete. My central point is that Krasnaya Moskva is an ideal lieu de mémoire in Nora's term, Pierre Nora's term. For context, let's consider a couple binary divisions that characterize the sense of smell. While the spontaneous distinction we make between good and bad odors is always an individually inflected judgment, The appreciation of odors is always also significantly culturally constructed and predetermined. Marx understood this very well when he wrote in the 1840s that the formation of the five senses is the labor of the whole world history to date. And the French social historian Alain Gorbin fully illuminated this fact in his seminal study of the sense of smell, the foul and the fragrant, in French in 1982. The individual variations assessing a scent are psychologically subjective and memory shaping. This is what has come to be known as the Proust moment or the Proust effect in literary and psychological studies. A re-encounter with a smell can trigger memory, recall scenes from one's past, and recreate narratives, often autobiographical, personal nature, recollections, memoirs, and so on, very much the history of À la recherche du temps perdu, In Search of Lost Times, Proust's great epic. This aspect of the sense of smell has helped to anchor Krasная Moskva in people's individual memories and numerous personal stories. Let's also look at the olfactory context, the smellscape or sensescape in which Krasная Moskva unfolds. A smellscape can be a room, even a body, but it can also be a country, a culture. The smellscape is often more easily perceived by those who enter it from the outside than by its permanent inhabitants. Here are a couple of examples from the Russian context. Smellscapes are marked by both space and time. And recently, historians in what they call now a sensory turn of historiography have started to integrate them, above all in social histories. My paper will conclude with such a history that has Krasная Moskva at its center. So the first example I want to bring here is Fitzroy MacLean, a Scottish nobleman and British diplomat who writes in his memoirs about his olfactory impressions in 1937 when he crossed the border into the Soviet Union and finds himself, quote, in the overpowering warmth of the customs building. He goes on, the smell was not quite like anything I had ever smelled before, a composite aroma compounded of various ingredients. There was always an old Russian smell, made up from the scent of black bread and sheepskin and vodka and unwashed humanity. Now to these were added the more modern smells, that's 1937, of petrol and disinfectant and the clinging, cloying odor of Soviet soap. The resulting slightly musty flavor pervades the whole country, he claims. Ian Fraser, the American writer and author of Travels in Siberia 2010, a much more recent example, ran into the country smell right upon landing at Sheremetyevo Airport in Moscow. He writes, I was hit by the smell of Russia, one I've encountered often since all over that country. The components of the smell are still a mystery. There's a lot of diesel fuel in it, and cucumber peels, and old tea bags, and sour milk, and sweetness, currant jam, or mulberries crushed into the waffled treads of heavy boots, and fresh mud, and a lot of wet cement. On another occasion, when Fraser arrived in the Russian Far Eastern town of Providenia, he comments on the difference between smellscapes. He says, America smells like gift shop candles, fried food, new cars. America's is the smell of commerce. The smell of America says, come in and buy. The smell of Russia says, ladies and gentlemen, Russia. MacLean and Fraser are explicit about memory and personal associations and thereby offer the potential for nostalgia, but it is the Swiss journalist Christoph Neidhardt who actually wrote the book that conceptualizes sensory locality and temporality beyond the individual, namely a sociocultural change. His book, Russia's Carnival from 2003, is precisely about the radical changes in the post-Soviet sensescapes, not just smell, but for the other senses as well. The sounds change, the visions change, the tastes change, new food comes on the market of the 1990s, when everything changed in the Soviet Union or post-Soviet Union, after it was thought to be forever, in Alexei Yurchak's phrase. Krasная Moskva, like so many other
I'm sorry to interrupt you, Hans, but we have a question. Is it okay that we have seen the first slide still?
Yes, there is
Okay.
only one.
Sorry to interrupt.
Okay, yeah. I'll change the slides later. It's still this one. So Krasna Moskva entered, as so many other consumer products, the space of free market and competitive environment in the 1990s, right? In order to claim standing for smells, however, beyond individual perceptions, we must be able to talk about odors and perfumes as a phenomenon in the public sphere and as part of the totality of a culture beyond the individual perfumistic encounter. That would be the Proust moment. For instance, in discourses about cleanliness and hygiene, toiletry, or fashion, discourses that accompany and shape social change or economic progress. It is in this way that smell enters the archive and persists beyond the ephemerality of its moments of individual experience or consumption. So let us construct that shared individual societal memory space that is the indispensable frame for cultural recycling. For this, let us conceive of shared memory as that which you know that all the others in your generation or cohort also know and know from experience, have struggled with, and now remember. I will equate such shared memory largely with what the cultural scholars Jan and Alida Assmann identify as communicative memory, which in their thinking at some point then turns into cultural memory. They set the maximum duration of the former at about a century, that is 3 to 4 generations of memory that, quote, constitutes itself in communication with others before turning and then, quote, crystallizing into the forms of objectivized culture in texts, images, films, and I argue here also a perfume. Krasna Moskva as a scent, as a liminal space integrating the individual and the social, the emotional and the historical, is now located a century after it appeared as a Soviet consumer product in the 1920s, at exactly the point when its anchoring in communicative memory has turned into cultural memory. Krasna Moskva is therefore sitting at the core of what I call a nostalgia complex, also perhaps a retro complex. We can talk about this afterwards. This space of overlap of individual and collective memory, uniting the Proust moment with the social development of the senses across generations, and which, in the case of the Soviet Union, amounts to the very construction of a new life world that is also sensory. After this conceptual and theoretical framing, I want to present Krasna Moskva in the second part of my paper as a central node of memory, nostalgia, and cultural recycling. I will make my points by drawing on the rich documentary sources that surround the perfume today and have given it cultural durability, if no guaranteed future in market persistence. For now, it is still available. You can buy it. I also want to point to the crucial role the internet now plays in dispersing and popularizing scent, not least via its vast commercial power, which for perfume and many other personal care products is wielded, and fashion products, is wielded by influencers. Theirs is now a leading voice in shaping the narrative of a product, and as a popular culture, material culture, fashion on websites and blogs that are often very well informed, in our case pushing the sillage or the schleif of a perfume of Krasna Moskva into the virtual space and perhaps towards eternal life in cyberspace. Who knows? The origins of Russian perfumery go back to French immigrant entrepreneurs in the 19th century. Thereby laid the earliest foundations for Krasna Moskva's French-Russian pedigree and its claimed kinship with Chanel No. 5. Here is the Alphonse Rallet factory for pomades, soaps, and powders. It made its beginning in Moscow in 1843. Henri Brocard started in 1846. After the Bolshevik Revolution, both successful enterprises were nationalized and renamed. Rallet's became Svoboda. Brocard's became Novaya Zarya, the producer of Krasna Moskva to this day, but since 2004, double named in the wake of a takeover and restructuring. That is now it's now called Brocard Novaya Zarya Nouvelle Étoile. There are many websites, as I said, Bois de Jasmin, Fragrantica, perfume websites of all kinds. I only want to refer to this one here, La Parfumerie. Despite its French title, it's a Russian language site. It pulls Krasnaya Moskva directly into the world of post-Soviet nostalgia. You can read the text yourself. Here it comes. What is important, here it is. Yes, you can see the text says that historically in Soviet households, you could find bottles of Krasnaya Moskva that evokes a sense of nostalgia about the times when we lived hard, scary, but somehow happily, with the belief and faith in a beautiful future. Now, this beautiful future is at the center very much of Yuka Grono's book, Caviar with Champagne from 2003, that locates Krasnaya Moskva in the context of Stalin's 1930s. This was a crucial decade in Soviet consumer history. As Stalin consolidated his power and the working class improved its economic standing, perfumes were added to caviar and champagne and chocolates. The izobilia, that cornucopia of consumer luxuries that communism promised its successful builders. By that time, fashion and style have turned away from Bolshevik avant-gardism already towards the classical, and Krasnaya Moskva is very much a part of this shift. Perfume becomes, as Yuka Grono phrases it, Stalin's gift to the ladies. The 1930s and post-World War II years were the high time of Krasnaya Moskva, but its standing began to diminish in the 1960s and 70s. Young women saw it as an old lady's scent. For them, the Polish Być Może was much more the fragrance of the time. So why then the nostalgia now, you may ask? Well, nostalgia is the central mood, I argue, of the contemporary political discourse in Russia as the Putin regime attempts to build a Russian identity based on the country's Soviet glory. Krasnaya Moskva is caught up in this, but unlike military parades and celebrations of historical dates that can be ordered by the government, the purchase of a perfume cannot, and the state has no personal memory to boot. The younger generation of consumers is aware of the precarious standing of the fragrance right now. They know that Krasnaya Moskva is both past its prime and located only in the middle to lower tier of the contemporary cosmetics market, where most of the domestic production of consumer goods ranks, not at the top. This claim can easily be ascertained on the numerous internet channels where young, mostly female influencers present their wares, Krasnaya Moskva among them. I give you just a couple examples. The woman on YouTube channel Ala Sense presents Krasnaya Moskva explicitly as a, quote, retro scent that, quote, some people find old-fashioned. Jill Snow White, you see her in the slide. It's her screen name, obviously. In a presentation of, quote, budget perfumes from domestic manufacturers, discusses the houses Novaya Zarya and Pokar, and says, with Novaya Zarya, many are already familiar because most of us have a babushka who wears Krasnaya Moskva. Alexa Pan, another one of these influencers, you see her here, in a long and clearly well-prepared reklamne informationna programa, is full of praise for the fragrances from Novaya Zarya that she introduces in a long program, almost an hour, as the legendary Russian Soviet brand. She uses both terms Ruskaya and Rossiyskaya and Sovietskaya marka. However, she points out that not all current Novaya Zarya scents carry the, quote, vintage aroma of Soviet perfumery or a specific historism. But she concedes that the scent is associated primarily with Soviet times, using the term schleif for the historical association rather than its perfumistic technical meaning. She merges both and links the fragrance to the past, but adding that Novaya Zarya is a great brand that is trying to survive in the current market, vyжить, she says. Positioning Krasnaya Moskva thus between its historical past and a possible future relevance is a difficult act, and we can see its promoters struggling. These women born after 1990 are free from nostalgia and personal memory links, and even the collective appreciation is fading into pure historical discourse for them. While this hollows out the emotive power of a perfume, the very deficit can be politically mobilized. It means Krasnaya Moskva has, for now, a future, namely the future of reconstructing the past. I want to conclude with the German historian Karl Schlögel's narrative of the history of Krasnaya Moskva in his recent book, Descent of Empires, Chanel No. 5 and Red Moscow. This book connects deeply with our zeitgeist. Schlögel's story is not new. The twin origins of the world's best-selling women's perfume and Krasnaya Moskva are known and have been told before, but Schlögel uses the history of Chanel No. 5 and Krasnaya Moskva to anchor an account which is overall a much broader East-West history of European cultural exchanges. It's a story he has told many times in many facets over the course of his career. You know, Schlögel is one of the great German historians of the Soviet Union, and his recent The Soviet Century is just being translated and coming out in English. But here he tells a smaller story, and he tells it in the realm of fashion, style, and consumer culture, with the perfume at the center. Its story begins, of course, with Rale and Prokar in Moscow. I introduced them, still in pre-revolutionary times. Schlögel draws connections and suggests that Michel, new Beau's formula for Bouquet de Napoleon. Michel is Prokar's perfumer, and Ernest Beau was Rale's perfumer, who had just created a couple historical scents, and one of them becomes the fragrance that then turns into Krasnaya Moskva, whereas Ernest Beau went back to Paris in 1913 and shared the formula for his Bouquet de Napoleon, the Bouquet de Napoleon, with Coco Chanel, and then from there on it turns into the other great fragrance, Chanel No. 5. Schlögel ultimately firms up the Michel as creator of Krasnaya Moskva story through Natalia Dolgopolova and Antonia Witkovskaya, who was around 2010 director of Novaya Zarya and declared in 2011 once and for all that it was Michel, it was Novaya Zarya who composed Krasnaya Moskva, while presenting a vintage bottle to Dmitry Medvedev, then president of Russia, thereby, of course, pulling the perfume explicitly into the Soviet and post-Soviet memory realm. We can say that with Schlögel's book, Krasnaya Moskva has now gained its widest diffusion, including academic respect, even if as a narrative rather than as a scent. The gift to Medvedev ties it clearly into national politics, a nexus, a Отечественность, that even current online influencers, Alexa Pan that I showed you, and advertisers understand and use. It's an Отечественный scent. Schlögel's view is the view of a historian. It is the longue durée, not the mood among young perfumistas today. For them to survive and have a future, a perfume must be more than a discourse. It must be materially present, desired, and purchased. And what you see is the current packaging of Krasnaya Moskva. My prediction is that Krasnaya Moskva as a perfume will linger, somewhat undistinguished among local brands. It will be one among hundreds or even thousands of scents to choose from, but it will fade. The young influencers currently still tell the historical narrative of the scent, but their own and their consumers' memory associations will be with new and unconnected, new things and unconnected to Soviet times, where it once was so much more than a perfume. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for your inspiring talk. Questions will be at the end. And now I would like to introduce our final speaker for the panel, Tyler Atkins, Princeton University. The paper titled Objects and Post-Soviet Infrastructure. Thank you. So,
hi.
Atkins, hi.
Hi. Yeah, first of all, thank you so much to the organizers for putting together this conference across several continents. It's truly a huge logistical undertaking. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. If I can find it, let's see. There we go. Is it displaying? All right.
Yes.
Yes, we can see everything.
Great. Let's go ahead and play. We were hunting for mushrooms, or my friends were anyway. After failing to distinguish the poisonous and non-poisonous mushrooms a few times, I was now expressly forbidden from picking them myself. So more accurately, I was pestering my interlocutors with questions as they hunted for mushrooms along a river at the edge of the village, high in the mountains of Russia's Altai Republic, where I was conducting ethnographic fieldwork. While my interlocutors' eyes were fixed to the ground, mine were following the river. Turning the next bend, we came across a wooden bridge, one of many linking the village to the taiga beyond. Supporting this quaint little piece of vernacular infrastructure, however, was a yellow cube, uncannily sitting in the river as if it had been placed there by a surrealist painter. A second later, I recognized it. It was the dismembered cabin of a Soviet-era Belarus tractor, many of which were actually still cutting hay in the village rather than enjoying new careers as bridge pylons. I pointed the tractor cabin out to my companions, who looked up briefly from their mushroom hunting. Yeah, they said, they really found a trick there, one person chuckled with minimal interest, returning her gaze to the forest floor. This kind of do-it-yourself design was, after all, nothing novel here in the remote corners of Altai Republic, where I was carrying out participant observation. My interlocutors, members of the Turkic-speaking Altai National Group, were constantly engaging in similar feats of material creativity, often taking as their canvas the objects of Soviet socialism, like tractors, cars, collective farm warehouses, etc., still ubiquitous in the landscape of most Altai villages. Indeed, many of my interlocutors were very direct and actually praising the quality of Soviet-era consumer objects over their contemporary counterparts, precisely because of the former's openness to tinkering and repair. Soviet things in the villages in which I worked aren't just ignored ruins, vehicles for nostalgia, or objects of purely intellectual reflection. They are constantly being revised, revisited, dismantled, reassembled, and repurposed to solve the pressing demands of post-Soviet rural life. Rather than being artifacts of an ossified past, Soviet things here are arguably objects of the future. Within the horizon of post-Soviet Altai forms of life, what seemed to me often to just be junk was actually constantly being afforded new potentials for material creativity. So in this short discussion, I would like to use the specific case of Altai Republic to illustrate an alternative temporality of the Soviet object, one that runs contrary to the common trope of Soviet objects as relics or ruins of the past. Of course, it would be easy to see this kind of ingenuity solely in terms of filling a material lack, or the creation of surrogates for consumer objects that either are unavailable or unaffordable. But Altai practices of tinkering aren't just a mimicry of aspired to consumer objects or absent state-built infrastructure. In the case of the former, for example, many of my interlocutors could actually afford to simply buy commercial analogs of their samodelki, but choose instead to make them themselves. So rather, my interlocutors' ways of retooling the material legacy of the Soviet past embodies a very particular way of thinking about objects in their design, which is neither exclusively Soviet nor exclusively and insularly traditional. It is a kind of everyday design thinking and practice, one which sees objects not bound by rigid functional and temporal limits, but possibilities for future transformation. So here, for example, is a late Soviet electric sewing machine in the villages I worked in Altai that has been turned into a combine for processing pine nuts, which are a major cash crop in Altai Republic. So the sewing machine's motor has been attached to a handmade wooden cylinder covered with nails for crushing pine cones. The aperture in the table where the actual sewing machine would have been located now allows for the processed nuts to fall into the sack below. The genesis of this machine involves a kind of analytic reading of the object and its function, the ability to see formal potentials that have little to do with the intended purpose of the consumer object that may have been envisioned by its original designers. So otherwise peripheral elements of the object, so here the aperture in the sewing machine, are reconfigured to be central. A similarly pine nut related object here is this backpack, which is used for transporting pine cones down from the remote dense mountain forests where they are gathered. The backpack is actually made out of cloth flour sacks from the late 80s or early 90s, with straps made from the recycled components of a horse saddle. The maker of this object wasn't just using it for a lack of alternatives. Indeed, nylon sacks are plentiful, cheap, and require much less effort to make. As the maker explained to me, however, she preferred the Soviet flour sacks because of their sturdiness, and it's indeed extremely difficult to think of any contemporary food packaging surviving many decades like these flour sacks. And also because of the breathability of the fabric, which prevented the pine cones from rotting in storage. So true garbage, as we might think of a discarded flour sack from 30 years ago, is almost an inadmissible category in Altai design thinking. If one thinks beyond fixed functions, almost everything has at least the possibility of future use in the right context. Rural Altai people similarly appropriate and repurpose the surviving elements of Soviet architecture that still dot the rural landscape. This building is the former collective farm garage of one of the villages where I conducted fieldwork. Following the breakup of the collective farm in the mid-90s, much of the building, including a good portion of its roof, had been scavenged for building material. Local herders more recently realized, however, that the protection from the elements provided by the remaining structure, coupled with its large doors originally made to allow tractors in and out, actually made it an ideal cattle corral. So today, in place of where the collective farm tractors used to be stored, the village's cattle now spend their winter. We could say that Altai designers in this capacity are almost like master Derridean deconstructionists, only with technical objects. In tinkering, fixing, cannibalizing, and reinventing things, my interlocutors disregard authorial intent, what the object may have been intended to do or to be by its original manufacturers. In creating semidelki like the ones here, my interlocutors focus on the latent potentialities of technical elements, dissociating them from one functional whole and seamlessly incorporating them in others. In this capacity, Altai design thinking is not just ideas about what constitutes a good or useful object. It is just as much a way of seeing objects, which is fundamentally different from the commodity logic of contemporary consumer culture. So for Western consumers buying, for example, an iPhone, the sort of universal synecdoche of the consumer world, the commodity is functionally and temporally finite. It has a function clearly marked by the manufacturer, and when this function is irreversibly broken down, we just throw it away. In Altai, though, the biography of an object does not end with its ostensible primary function. The Altai way of looking at technical objects is one of the very longue durée, in anticipation of both future breakdown and future recreation, linked by a constant process of care and repair. I was particularly struck by this attitude while observing my interlocutors building fences, stables, and cabins. And as I watched them do this, I realized that they were just as concerned with how easy the buildings would be to eventually dismantle in the future as they were with their long-term stability. As one of my Altai friends told me as we cannibalized the lumber from an old chicken coop in order to build a cabin, who knows, maybe this will be a chicken coop again next time you're here. Altai vernacular design values are thus concerned not only with how an object executes its given function, but how easily its components can be liberated for new possibilities. And of course, this creative approach to the materials of the Soviet past has analogs all across post-Soviet space. Russian artist Vladimir Arkhipov, for example, assembled a really wonderful collection of semidelki from the 90s, including this antenna made out of mostly forks. This is something that we find all across Soviet space and post-Soviet space. However, while this bricolage with the materials of the past is a larger post-Soviet phenomenon, in the case of Altai Republic, we can see a particular historical continuity in these attitudes, not just with the Soviet, but also with the pre-Soviet past. Prior to their sedentarization in the 20th century, most Altai people were seasonally transhumanant, meaning they moved with their livestock between winter and summer pastures. Given the mobility of Altai pastoralists, it's unsurprising that the construction of, for example, the traditional Altai home called a chadir reflected the design values of deconstructibility and transformation. The 20th century Altai artist Grigory Choras-Burkin documented these elements of Altai material culture in his ethnographic drawings. So virtually every element of the conical larch bark covered chadir, in which most people in the Altai Mountains lived until the 19th century, could be very quickly dismantled and transported by horse or wagon to the next pasture. Altai design practices are also informed by Altai cosmology. Many Altai people regard not just sacred mountains and springs, but also cars, cooking utensils, and other everyday tools as possessing a spirit master, or in Altai iRLI. In other words, these objects have a degree of social and ethical personhood that in turn render practical human interactions with them ethically valent. I was frequently told by my interlocutors that, for example, it was wrong to yell at your car if it was having mechanical problems. And if you were actually to raise your voice at it, the car would probably just break down entirely out of spite. Some of my interlocutors emphasize that even basic household items like pots and pans should be treated respectfully and cared for as something possessing a spirit master. I recall asking a friend of mine, for example, why she refused to throw away an old Soviet era electric oven which hadn't worked in years. I'm an Altai person, she said. I'm not just going to throw away something that's made food for me for years. So the fact that objects are to some degree social persons for Altai people figures heavily in the temporality of Altai design practices. For my interlocutors, technical objects are bound to humans not just by momentary utilitarian convenience, but by a long-term ethical bond of care and mutual benefit. But Altai reworkings of Soviet things are not just the fitting of a socialist content to a national form. The original material form of these objects is itself not relevant. The possibilities for Altai design thinking are facilitated by the capacities of Soviet consumer objects, not just to endure, but to actually welcome frequent transformation. This is a big reason why Soviet-made automobiles are still immensely popular in the villages in which I work. Surprisingly, Soviet cars are actually a post-Soviet phenomenon in this corner of Altai. So during the actual Soviet period, there were virtually no personal automobiles in the collective farms where I carried out research. Most people got around by horse or bicycle or motorcycle, aside from the cars actually owned by the collective farm. And it was only in the 1990s when used Soviet cars became available that most farmers here started to buy them, consciously preferring them to foreign-made cars. This stemmed largely from the fact that Soviet cars like the Lada Niva are extremely easy to fix. Their internal mechanics are extremely simple and accessible to the amateur mechanic. This was largely a conscious design decision on the part of Soviet automakers. In contrast to the American auto industry, which pioneered the concept of planned obsolescence to hasten the turnover of older models and increase sales, car manufacturers in the planned socialist economy didn't want to make more new cars. Whereas American car makers produced automobiles primarily as market goods aimed at generating exchange value. Soviet car production was aimed, at least in principle, at meeting the rational needs of consumers for transportation. Given the production deficits and the shortage of service stations in the late Soviet Union, late Soviet cars, while lacking showroom appeal, were also built to stay on the road as long as possible. And if they were to break down, they were also designed to be extremely easily repaired by drivers themselves. So the design of Soviet cars has a strange elective affinity for post-Soviet life in rural Altai. Not only do these cars hold up admirably in the extreme conditions of the Altai Mountains, but the fact that they can be repaired very easily spares many cash-poor subsistence herders the onerous burden of purchasing new cars. What's more, the fact that these cars are mechanically simple and transparent facilitates the kind of tinkering, care, and transformation valued by Altai vernacular design. This line of argument could be extended to many other categories of Soviet consumer objects that one still finds all over villages in Altai Republic. The relative simplicity and durability of things like Soviet cars, refrigerators, sewing machines, and objects like that make them much more receptive to becoming the sort of spirited objects that Altai design thinking seeks out to transform. From this perspective, the story of Soviet objects in the Altai village by no means ends with perestroika. Importantly, the survival of these objects can't be attributed solely to nostalgic attachment, nor to simple material necessity, although that definitely plays a part. Instead, Altai villagers approached Soviet things as not only having a past and a present, but also a future, new potential usages, combinations, and transformations. Indeed, in the present age of planned obsolescence, where landfills are flooded with the refuse of fast fashion and disposable electronics, the creative afterlives of Soviet objects in places like rural Altai Republic offer a chance to envision an alternative life of the consumer object outside of our own ever more catastrophically wasteful thing system. If actually existing Soviet things often deviated from the utopian horizon envisioned for them by Soviet planners, they nonetheless could be said to offer a fragment of a kind of accidental utopia of their own. They are things which, despite their plainness, open themselves up to all sorts of new human and material becoming. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Tyler. So now we can move to the discussion. I so far don't see any questions in the chat room. So those who want to ask a question, you are welcome. And you can raise your hand if somebody is talking, or you can just ask the question if there is no line. So I can see Thomas.
Yeah, I can start if that's fine. Thank you all for your presentations. It was very interesting. I have a question sort of combined, I believe, to Olga and Hans. Since Olga, you brought in this term of retro, as Kevin Platt pointed it out, and I very much like that you brought that in. I didn't think of it myself when I prepared for the conference at all, actually, but I was wondering all day if we're actually able to find a different term to grasp these trans-temporal communities between cultural objects that form themselves in a term other than nostalgia, because I myself also always keep sort of gravitating back to nostalgia. And I was wondering.
So, yes.
I was wondering if, in general, you think maybe retro as a term that grasps more the presence of the past object or the presence of the past in the present, without emphasizing this gap between it, this inaccessibility, this lostness of the past, might be in general a very good way to think of this trans-temporal dimension of recycling, maybe even a little more so than nostalgia. And then to Hans, I was thinking, if you mentioned the term retro in passing yourself when you said that these influencers who were born after 1990 would likely not feel nostalgic about Krasnaya Moskva. So maybe is retro then a term in the sense that Platt brought it forth and that Olga referred us to it, maybe a term that could grasp this relationship in which maybe also younger generations enter with these objects.
If I could
okay,
if I could just
so Hans, you
this.
will go ahead, and then maybe Olga will have something to add. So please.
I find the distinction very useful between retro and nostalgia, in that retro is really nostalgia without the emotion, without the psychology, without the longing, and also sort of a stripped down commercial pragmatic version of recycling something. And we talked about this with Sinaida yesterday, I think it was, also because she addressed this issue. Of course, nostalgia can also be reconstructed for those people who have not actually lived through the time or dealt with the objects or the situations. It can be reconstructed partially in public discourse when it becomes political, and also in private, in family traditions and so on. I think nostalgia can cross generations, but the more pragmatic and common and market and commercial aspect is retro, and in fashion and style and these kinds of products, you see it a lot.
I would agree with that. Yeah, I would agree with that as well. I think that this distinction is very useful. I think retro really takes away that what Kevin Platt calls this incurable homesickness, right? Or this kind of attachment on a very human level, right? The emotional connection to that piece. And I think, you know, be it a consumer product item or a pop cultural item from the Soviet era, right? Today's generation certainly doesn't have that connection to that. And, you know, I think nostalgia is highly individual, and there may be a particular person, you know, even amongst today's YouTube influencers who has, for whatever reason, that nostalgic memory. I think, Hans, as you mentioned, that, you know, for somebody it might have been the grandmother's scent, right? Or something that really connects to a personal family tradition. But I think nostalgia really has that sort of psychological connection, as opposed to retro that is perhaps referring more to this kind of empty shell, a frame, more of reference, right? Without that direct, well, homesickness, right? Or that connection that retro certainly does not have. So I think this is a very useful distinction as well.
More of a sense of less this pathologizing aspect that nostalgia sometimes gets in some uses of the term, and more sort of a more conscious appropriation of the thing is what swings with it, I think.
Mm-hmm. I also wonder if nostalgia somehow rings, at least to my ear, as something that almost longing for something, right? Sort of missing something, right? More again of a sort of this personal.
That's etymologically the case, yeah.
Precisely, right? And so I think that is not at all there with a lot of these consumer items. Let's say with the case of the perfume, right? I can't imagine that anybody's longing for the era of the, you know, when the perfume came out, right? Or when those Estrada songs were singing. Although who knows, someone maybe, again, it's very personal. So I think nostalgia perhaps is more of a personal kind of ringing, right, than retro.
Mm-hmm. Okay,
No,
thank you. And I see raised hands. So next question is Zinaida Vasilyeva and then Bretsley.
Yeah.
So Zinaida, you're welcome.
Yeah, thank you. So my question is for Tyler, and I think to some extent it also goes back to the paper of Anthony Kalashnikov that I think was yesterday, but I listened to it today in the morning, and partly maybe with Hans. It resonates with Hans' presentation. I was thinking, let's say, about this the temporality embedded in the material infrastructures or in the material environment that we live in. And so Antony's argument was that the Stalinist material heritage is so strong, and let's say the temporality of the future, which is embedded in these infrastructures, is so strong that it works even today. And so I kind of understand that you are doing the same argument, but at the same time, because I also worked quite a lot with a similar material, I would like to challenge it, because is it really about the future that is it really the future that is embedded in these technologies for this, at least for your subjects, not for you analytically? Because I understand that we are doing this kind of Anthropocene or eco-technology argument by referring to this beautiful object. But do your subject also think in these categories? It's also possible that the Altai, let's say, regional specificity allows you maybe to push a little bit further this argument. But similar objects you can find in Moscow region or in Leningradskaya Oblast, so you don't need to go to Altai region to find them. And it's really not about the future. I think it's about this work of maintenance, which is relevant for today and for kind of to maintain the today in the struggle. And so it's maybe more a commentary rather than a question, but another link that I would like to do here is the question of, let's say, the political economy, which is behind the cultural production that we analyze. Because of course, to build, let's say, the Stalin's era monument, you need a different type of relations between the human labor and the projects of construction. rather than behind these naive technologies that you just presented, or that Arkhipov collected, where actually this effort is minimal, and where the goal is basically to maintain one's family environment. But I think it's also relevant to think about this political economy and what is behind the goods. Also, in the case of perfumes or any other cultural production, which in different ways recycle Soviet or socialist heritage, or just, put by entrepreneurial means imposed on us by postmodern and post-industrial economy to reinvent things. Thank you.
Mhm. So thank you for your question, Tyler. Please answer. Then will be Bradley, and I saw raised hands. Then will be Anna and Hans.
Oh, that's a really excellent point. And I definitely, it is a super, every time I talk to anybody from the former socialist world about my material, everyone they say this is absolutely everywhere. And I am definitely sort of interested in the regional specificity. And I think that also touches a little bit on your comment about the exact nature of the temporality, because I think for my interlocutors, the temporality of these objects isn't world historical or national temporalities. So much of it is if it has a future temporality, it's the future temporality of any relationship between ethical subjects. So their notion of the object being open to the future is being open to and demanding future care, future repair, as opposed to opening up a sort of like new historical horizon. And I think that's one of the sort of personhood of objects and the sort of animist undercurrent of technical objects in Altai is, I think, what gives this particular subdialect of post-Soviet repair culture an interesting historical continuity with the past, and also perhaps a different structure to other forms of repair culture that are found in other parts of the former Soviet Union. And the political economy thing is also really a really excellent point, especially with a lot of the sort of do-it-yourself infrastructure projects, which are driven as much by the desire to repair as the difficult condition of being a farmer in contemporary Siberia, and low levels of investment, accessibility to finance, access to finance, and stuff like that. So that's a really important point as well.
Thank you, Tyler, for your answer. Bradley, go ahead, please.
Thanks. Thanks for these great presentations, everybody. I have a general question that I think kind of struck me as the presentations came together, about the connection between recycling and creativity or innovation. And it seems that, well, Shnurov's argument with which we started this whole thing is that sort of recycling inhibits creativity, right? By using these sort of Soviet songs instead of more recent songs, these people are sort of reaching back into a past, and the show is premised on epigonstvo, right? I mean, it's all about trying to be as good as the original. And Hans' presentation was also about the sort of the persistence of infrastructure continuing the same scent, right, throughout these eras. Not about the sort of innovation of new scents, but both Mark's and Tyler's presentations show the recycling of the Soviet as something that is really innovative and really new, and even in Tyler's presentation, sort of future oriented. So I'm wondering what you just all the presenters see as the difference between those things. Is it sort of, as Tyler mentioned, a sort of Derridian relationship to authorial intention? Is it this sort of modular relationship to objects that they can be taken apart and put back together in different ways? Or is it sort of, in Mark's interpretation, something sort of a playful camp relationship to original intent, original objects, and their resurrection? And how do you see that sort of separation? I'm not sure exactly who is interested in answering this question. It doesn't need to be from everybody, but I would be curious to hear responses. Thank you.
Bradley, I think sorry, go ahead.
So who is interested?
I
Yes,
don't even have
go
probably an answer to your question, Bradley. I think it's an excellent question. It's more a comment. Your point about Golas being based on epigonstva, I don't necessarily see it as such. Not Golas. I don't think they necessarily try to be as good as the original. Shows like Toch v Toch, of course, also Channel 1, right, where they actually try to be just like that character, right, just like Anna German. There they really do. And that's where the judges are comparing the contestant to that original. And they're really not only just in the voice and the, not really parody, right, but actually replication of the sound of the original, but also the makeup. And there would always be lots of comments about oh, they really made you look just like that character, right? That's, of course, another foreign format that Russia adopted. So I think that show specifically is just that. Golas, in my view, the way I look at, genuinely uses songs, be it Soviet, post-Soviet, foreign, even, 19th, 18th century opera. Russia is very big on including these high culture forms. It really is about showing your own voice. We are looking for the best voice of the country. Even when we are in the sort of this voice senior, right, Nagiyev, who is the host, constantly reminds the viewers, it's not about granny and grandpa. That's not what we're doing here. We are not, dealing with the touching subjects, right? We are looking for the best voice, right? Your age doesn't matter, nothing matters. It's just the voice. And of course, hence the judges are looking, not looking at the contestants, right? During the blind auditions, it's the back to the performer, right? It's completely detached from the original. It's what you as a performer do. I know it really doesn't answer your question, but it just kind of struck me as just something that I really don't see epigonstva as something there.
Thank you. Mark, I see that your microphone is on. You have something to add?
I'm happy to add. Thank you, Brad, for the question. I think that the relation here, to continue what Olga said, is different, very different. But in the show like Golas, it's just a material, right? So what can this new singer sing, but something that is sort of accessible, very, very well known, etc., right? But even in this show, which, as Olga mentioned, is different from Toch v Toch, interpretation doesn't count, right? The original interpretation of the sort of well-known Soviet song, it's not what they're looking at. They're looking at Golas, as we said, right? It's not about interpretation. While of course in Mameshev's and similar postmodernist works with the Soviet legacies, say Sorokin, Prigov, etc., we all know these examples. The Soviet material is radically transformed, right? It is radically reinterpreted, and its interpretation, which is aggressively confronting the traditional interpretation, is what counts. So I think here we are dealing with some kind of the neutrality of the material, which suggests more or less diminishing of the question of interpretation, right? And the perception of the material as something very much loaded, ideologically, politically, culturally, etc., and the interpretation as a form of polemics, as a form of rewriting, etc., etc. So I think that here the similarity is deceptive. We are dealing with absolutely different processes. I don't know, friends.
Yeah. So thank you. Any more comments on the question?
Yeah, if I could quickly step in. We have many balls in the air now in terms of points of discussion. I just want to speak to Zinaida and to Tyler, the sort of material, the recycling, reuse, reconstruction of material objects. And I want to throw a name in that we haven't, that is not at the conference. she is a historian and cultural studies scholar at the University of Amsterdam, Sudha Rajagopalan. She has an interesting work about Soviet material culture and its usage and its afterlife in India and Cuba. And it's an empirical project, a project where she does interviews and people sort of combined the aspects, the practical aspects of fridges and sewing machines and other objects, the practical use that they still get, together with the emotional and the historical aspects, how their fathers or mothers or whatever brought or got these products from somehow out of the Soviet Union into Cuba. Okay, Cuba was of course an ally after a certain time, India initially, but then not. So what she uses the recycling of concrete material objects for is also to deconstruct the kind of Cold War binary understanding, saying these objects actually tie into they meet American cars in Cuba, for instance, Soviet sewing machines, and so on. So they're very interesting things. And I just thought that might be an interesting reference for both of you as you work with this. Regarding Bradley, very interesting, the sort of the idea of recycling hindering progress, somehow preventing, new innovation. I think that, I think it's possible, but with perfume as an aesthetic product, right? It has no use value whatsoever. It's strictly aesthetic. In a sense, no progress has been made. Now, every perfumer would jump at me of saying this because, yes, there are new molecules, there's chemistry, there's synthesizing, there's a vast new industry of artificial flavors and fragrances going on. There is progress in that sense. But the use of the product, its application and what it's supposed to do has never changed at all, right? And so in that sense, the question of innovation is not really relevant for a perfume, right? It's fashion, it's rhetoric, it's branding, it's self-styling, and that underlies vagaries of time. But I don't think there is really much progress in a sort of linear, material, practical sense. These are the two things I wanted to add. Thank you.
If I may,
thank you, Bradley. Are you happy with the answers? So Tyler, please go ahead.
Oh, very, very briefly. Regarding Bradley's question, and the difference between sort of epigonsta and sort of the creative recycling, I think despite the association of recycling with preservation, there's also a tremendously destructive aspect to recycling, and I think to all forms, especially this creative recycling. I think I encounter this a lot in my field site where, as an anthropologist, I'm looking for old stuff because I think it's cool, but it's all been taken apart and completely reused for other stuff. So there's, in a sort of counterintuitive way, I think the most creative forms of recycling, the most sort of off the block forms of recycling, are oftentimes the ones that have the most aggressive and materially destructive relationship to their to the material of the past. In some way, sort of like consumes the past and their creativity. Which I think is, one could also say is what happens in forms of sort of parody and reinterpretation as well.
Thank you. Bradley, as you initiated such a long discussion, do you have anything to say, Bradley? Thank you. Just thank you. Okay. Our next question is from Anna Svetlova. Anna, please.
Thank you. Okay, first of all, I would just say that maybe I would argue with what Mark said about the interpretation in the voice, because in my opinion, interpretation sometimes is the main reason actually why audience like this particular performance. Of course, I can't remember any example when they turned the Soviet aesthetic upside down. No, I think it's not the purpose, but I would say that interpretation matters anyway. And actually my question is for Olga. Thank you very much for your presentation and for statistics, which was quite interesting and refreshing for me. My question can maybe add a bit of another perspective from the point of the reception of the program. Do you know the blogger, the YouTuber U-Level Kadaf? Because she is from this booktube community. She tells about books, but also she is a long time fan of Lev Leshchenko, who is the coach in voice in senior voice program, and she is 30 something. She's not from this generation who actively lived in Soviet Union, but somehow the content and her sentiment for Leshchenko, Kobzon, Magamayev, who are also prototypes for characters of her own books, and the way she comments on the show, because she follows what's going on. She was at the filming of the program and shared with the audience, and the whole community around her books, her channel on YouTube. I think it can show somehow that this reception is not so straight as it may seem. Yeah, that it can just explain something of how the reception of such programs works. So yeah, thank you.
Well, thank you very much. That's it's very interesting. I'll have to look into U-Level Kadaf, right? Is that the name? I'll definitely have to look into her for turning Soviet aesthetics upside down. I mean, they actually do it quite a bit, and I think that for especially live rounds, for the audience reception, it is extremely important. I actually don't have the statistics, and that would be something interesting to look into, the breakdown of demographics, the age, who actually watches specifically which show, and I don't know if such information even exists. But that would be something interesting to look into. Probably would be harder to track because voice is now everywhere. It's on social media. You can watch it through, parts of it through Facebook, parts of it through YouTube, right? It's really everywhere. But whatever they track, it would be interesting to look into. But if you think of like Creed's most recent and voice Дети, just really a couple months ago, take on Spят усталые игрушки, it's not quite rap, but it's fairly contemporary, right? So he takes this song from 64 and again makes it uber contemporary. And of course, the fact that it's associated with Creed, who himself is an uber contemporary person, I think brings that song into, he also tied with Нет Eurovision's Toy song, if you guys remember that one, right? He kind of спят усталые игрушки, so he took this into игрушка, into I'm not your toy, right? He kind of played this intertextual reference to all sorts of different, very recent pieces, which I think really resonated with the audience. So I think the interpretation, I agree with you entirely, is extremely important, especially for the voting audience. Once you get into those voting rounds, the perception, the reception of the audience, I think is extremely important. While the judges vote, I think there's different politics involved. I think once the audience begins voting, if we take all the other politics that could be involved, right, I really think reception and interpretation truly does come into play. And making certain pieces contemporary, I think does sometimes make it more attractive to the younger viewers for sure. But thank you, that was a great question.
Thank you. Anybody has more questions? Since I don't see any questions, I have a question for Mark.
Excuse me, I have a question.
Любовь Victorina.
Yes.
Tim has a question.
I'm sorry to interrupt you. You can ask. First, but
I haven't seen your hand.
Okay, yeah.
Sorry.
Maybe my video is not visible.
No, I just looking at the participants and just
I'm
no
sorry.
hand. But go ahead.
Okay,
please.
Thank you. Yes. So I was interested in this discussion about retro and nostalgia, and I think I just have a brief comment on it. It picks up on something that Hans said about the connection between retro and the market, because I'm not sure what the value is of speaking about retro in terms of a historical term. It seems to me that it is a sort of ahistorical suggestion that something from the past can just be available in the present. And this could be a perfume that is produced the same way for hundreds of years, or it could be some sort of marketing device that you can just be returned to the past in consuming something. I think that you're right to point out that nostalgia involves some sort of loss or some sort of psychological component, but I think that you can't have something that's past without a loss. It's always lost. So I just wanted to comment on that. Maybe you can respond, but I don't see the critical value of the term retro yet exactly.
So will you answer, please?
Well, the critical value, I would argue, consists precisely in its opposite to nostalgia, right? You're right, and I think it's a very good observation. It's a term that can be called up for recycling mostly fashion and style issues, and there in fashion, it's a key driver of innovation that in principle looks backwards, but with a view to moving into the future, right? But there's no the emotional, the longing, the missing dimension is missing, right? But also everything from the past you said implies a sense of loss if it's no longer there. But there are also things that should be lost, right? It's not. There's that too, and nobody would care for them if they or would not want them to come back. It looks like Mark wants to say something. Mark, no.
It seems to me also that the that retro is very surface oriented, and nostalgia seems to be interested in a little bit more depth, and I think that that's actually one of the things that that this sort of physical deconstructive element of, I think, both Tyler's and Mark's presentation gets at. They get beyond the surface level by physically taking things apart, and keeping things together is very retro. Smooth surfaces, commodities, selling.
Luba, do you hear me?
Yeah, yes, there was some interruption of the connection, I can hear. So we have just a few minutes left, 3 minutes left. Any more questions? But I am still, in this case, I'm asking the question to Mark Lipovetsky. I am still interested, for example, if something like this changing clothes, male and female characters, comes not from the Soviet tradition, but for example, from some foreign films that were popular in the Soviet Union, like «В джазе только девушки» or «Tutsi». So how can you, would it generate in this case some kind of different type of connection, or you will just dismiss such kind of cases? Like what are, if the roots of borrowing this material, they are not necessarily in Soviet culture, but they are mediated by the Soviet culture or come from foreign sources directly?
I don't actually understand what the question is about. Of course, there were examples of drag queens, as you mentioned, somebody likes it hot and Tutsi, and in Mamashev's case, of course, that Someone Likes It Hot was probably the only film with Monroe that was available before Perestroika, and that impressed him greatly, and this entire drag queen atmosphere was there. But the very concept of drag queen was not known in the Soviet Union. It was completely dissociated with the entire gay culture, with the entire camp culture. Until now, we are reading articles about same Mamashov Monroe, where all his very funny productions are interpreted extremely seriously as some kind of symbols of longing for the lost glory and lost greatness. So whatever taken out of context doesn't have the full meaning. Of course, dressing men in female clothing can be found everywhere. We can find it, and we have them there, right? In Ivan Grozny by Eisenstein in the final part of Dances of Obrichniki. But Sam Zontak writes that Eisenstein is not quite yet drag. So if it would be more exaggerated, then it would be drag. But it doesn't matter because we do not have the context, we don't have the language. It did exist in the pre-revolution culture, then it was sort of pushed into underground, then it was criminalized, right? And therefore, whatever jokes with cross-dressing were present in foreign production, in Soviet production, they were not interpreted as such. That's what I mean.
Thank you.
Luba, we do not hear.
So should we call it a day? I think it's time to close our session. It was great discussion and great papers. Thank you very much. And I hope to see all of you, if not all of you, then many of you tomorrow in the morning or during the day. So thank you.